My name is Gaylen Masters, and I was born to, my father was William Albert Masters, and he was born in England. My mother was born, and her name was Audrey Despain, and she is the second wife, and I am one of 6 children born to a second wife of my father. And I was born on the 21st of October, 1929, in a little town in Idaho, Buell, Idaho. And it wasn't but about 3 weeks ago I visited that little house on the farm of 80 acres. And the same rock house that I was raised in still exists as it was then. And that house was built by my grandfather and my brother and my dad from the Snake River Valley. I'm a farm boy, had to milk 5 cows morning and night, worked 7 days a week, grew up in that environment, which was a blessing, a great blessing as I look back, but I didn't like it. In our farm experience, we had no running water. We had an outhouse. I don't know whether you know what an outhouse is, but anyway, we had no electricity. It was all kerosene. And so those early years were very important in building a certain character called work. I knew how to work. Schoolhouse was a mile away, which we walked all year. I was 3 of graduating class when I was in the 1st grade with those 2 boys, and so the school attendance, as far as numbers, were about 12, 15 of us at the time. One-room schoolhouse that wasn't as big as my living room downstairs. And so we lived on a farm, and in that farm we made the living during the Depression time and milked cows, raised livestock. So until I was 14 years old, I lived in Buell, Idaho, and then I moved to Seattle, Washington. Living in Buell, Idaho on a farm with all the characteristics of a farm boy, moving to Seattle, Washington, where my mother moved because my brothers and sisters were in World War II. And they were in the service in Seattle. And so my dad sold the farm. We moved to Seattle, close to the University of Washington. My mother purchased an apartment house close by a high school, Roosevelt High School. And that's where I went as a freshman. The attendance of that school was 2,500. You can imagine graduating with 3 of us in the 8th grade and transferring to Seattle was a great shock. The city, the climate, the country, totally foreign to me. It's rather embarrassing being a country boy going into that high school dressed as a farm boy. It didn't take me long to change my wardrobe, because I was immediately identified as a country boy. Kind of ashamed of it in that environment. And so for 4 years, I attended Roosevelt High School. Wasn't very good academically because I had a job after school at the Edmund Mini Hotel as a busboy. And so it was kind of an adventurous 4 years in high school. I graduated but couldn't get into any college because I had no academic background. So I attended a 5th year in high school. And when the veterans came out in 1947, they opened Broadway High School for veterans. And I attended that, taking algebra and geometry and English and things I didn't take when I was in high school. I applied for the University, Washington, was turned down, and applied at BYU. And they let me in on condition after I had completed all those. So then I graduated from BYU, where I met my wife, Mary Reen Masters, Rencher. And she was from St. George, Utah. And she was a country girl. And so both of us attended BYU at the same time. I loved BYU. The attendance there was 4,500. Successfully completed 2 years and a half and transferred to the University of Washington, where I was hoping to get an ROTC because of the draft. I didn't get in. I didn't want to get in because I had to spend too much time. And so I graduated from the University of Washington, and 30 days after I graduated, I was in the Army. And so I spent 2 years in the United States Army, went to Fort McClellan, Alabama, and became a clerk typist, all because in high school I had 1 credit shy of graduating, and the counselor said, "Why don't you take a typing class?" And so I said, "Why should I take typing?" And he says, "Because there are 34 girls in that class." So me and another boy signed up for typing 1. In that class, I was given a D, and the teacher said, "Gaylen, you didn't pass in your budgets, and if you'll pass in your budgets and sign up for typing 2, I'll give you an A, and I want you in typing number 2. And so I took typing number 2, and I could type 60 words a minute, which kept me from Korea, in the battlefield of Korea, because MacArthur was running the Incheon sweep back to North Korea, and I went to Fort McClellan as a clerk typist, and my company went to Korea. And so I think it's called divine intervention. And why I took a typing class, I then knew, saved me from going to Korea. So the Lord paid attention to me. Now, I was baptized when I was 12 years old, not when I was 8, because we weren't active in the church in the farm. It was too far to go to church. And so I was married in the temple because my wife insisted on being married in the temple because I was not active in the church when I was working at the Edmund Mini Hotel. I worked on Sundays. When I went to the Y, I discovered the Mormon Church and what I believed in, what I should have believed in. And when it came time to go into the service, I was married to Mary Reen in the St. George Temple. When I was going to BYU, I was called on a mission to Mexico. And when I was interviewed by Brother Kimball, I asked if I could be deferred from December, finishing the semester that I was in, because of the Army, and he said yes. And so I wasn't permitted to go on a mission because I had been deferred 3 times. And so I had to go into the Army, and I missed going on a mission to Mexico. Okay, let me just backtrack a little bit about my background. My father was born in England. He was a convert to the church, and he had the experience when he was 19 years old of meeting 2 Mormon missionaries who knocked on their door and asked to stay the night because they were there without purse or script, which means they didn't have any money, and they asked to stay. And his father and parents belonged to the Church of England, very devout. And the father gave a condition. He said, "You can stay, but you do not talk about your religion." And so when they left in the morning, they left the Book of Mormon. My father read it, found it to be true, sought out the missionaries, and was converted. His dad gave him an ultimatum. He said, "If you join the Mormon Church, you're out of the family." And so at 19 years old, he emigrated to America. He was active in the church. He was called on a mission, and he went to down south at the time when the South wasn't very happy to have Mormon missionaries. And so he had quite a difficult time, but he filled a mission. He got married, and he had a family with his first wife, and he had 5 children. And his wife died after the fifth child of typhoid fever that was sweeping America at the time. And so that's when he married my mother. But there are 6 children in the second family that he had. Living in Seattle, in a big city, made a great impression on me and had something to do with my development. My oldest brother, who I did not know, Arlie, lived in Tacoma with the family, and Venetia, who also was in the service. Arlie was in the service. He helped build the Alcan Highway as far as the legal department went. He was in charge of that. He lived in Lakewood, Washington. My sister was in the Red Cross, and my brother was on the Navy, and they were all stationed here in the Northwest, and that's why we landed here, because my parents wanted to be near my family. My mother worked at Boeing's. My dad got a job in the shipyards. And as I mentioned before, I got a job in the Edmund Mena Hotel as a busboy. After graduating from BYU, Lorraine, my wife, taught for a year while I attended the University of Washington. And as I also mentioned, after 30 days of graduating, I was in the United States Army and was stationed in Fort McClellan, Alabama, as a clerk typist, as I mentioned before. But in that time, I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer. And so when I got out of the Army, after 2 years of service, I attended the University of Utah Law School for 2 years. And after 2 years in law school, the university, living in Salt Lake, I discovered I did not like law. So I transferred to something I liked, and that was English, and so that was school teaching. And finally, through a procedure called serendipity, and that means when the divine intervention comes in, your life is changed to what maybe the Lord wants you to be. So I graduated then in school teaching, secondary education. After completing time in the BYU for 2.5 years, and the rest of the years at the University of Washington, graduating in political science, I was all ready for law school, and that's where I went. Disillusioned after 2 years, going into English, and I failed to mention the fact that when I graduated, Mary and I got married in St. George, Utah. And that was kind of ironic because I had no intention of getting married in the temple until I met my wife, and she said that she was not going to get married without being married in the temple. So that meant I had to be active in the church. And in Alabama, we did get active in the church. And so that kind of fell into place. After marriage, then service, and then activities, and then the life became more and more filled with the church. Disappointed not being able to go on a mission to Mexico, that went by the wayside. Thought maybe I wouldn't be able to serve any kind of a mission. So I got a job at Morton High School. Now Morton High School is in the shadow of Mount Rainier. It's a little logging community. And for 2 years I taught there. And Morton was a great experience for being exposed to education and how important it was and how delightful teaching kids becomes, which it did over a period of time. But it was a tough 2 years because beginning teachers get a low salary. and to get every class that every other teacher doesn't want in the English department, the speech department, and sometimes even the math department or any place else. And so I learned the skill of teaching in Morton High School. Transferred from there to eventually at Clover Park High School in a junior high. And then for 14 years I taught junior high at Clover Park at Hutloff Junior High, with the promise when I came into the district that it would be the first opening in the high school that I could have. And so 14 years later, after being frozen in that grade, loving the 9th grade, I was transferred then to Clover Park High School and taught there at the same time trying to get my master's degree at the University of Puget Sound. I taught at McNeil Island for the junior college, and so I spent 8 years teaching for the junior college as well as high school. Well, in the interim, after first getting married, our first son was born, and he's Guy Mason. Guy Mason, and he was born in 1954, and I got out of the service in 1952. Then our next child was Gail, and she was born in 1957. And the third child was Adrene, and she was born in 1958. And then the next child was Lorene, born in 1960. Then Kathy Ann was born in 1961. And then the last child, who was a son, Craig, was born in 1964. So that made 6 children. When we were going together, quite seriously, I said I'd like to have 2 girls, 2 boys. Marion said she'd like to have 3 girls and 2 boys. So we ended up, the first and the last were boys, making it 2, and the other were 4 girls, and so we compromised with 6 children. And after transferring from Morton to Clover Park, there was one other at Franklin Pierce. I spent 2 years in the 9th grade there before Clover Park. But we bought a place, rented a place at our present location, years later, was University Place and Sunset Beach. And we rented our first house here on the water with the track in one side and the water on the other for 2 years, and then we moved lock, stock, and barrel about 6 houses further down the beach, where we lived for many years and raised all 6 children. They survived, believe it or not, with the train on one side, the ocean on the other side, Puget Sound. People would come and visit, and they said, that's the most dangerous place in the world to live, the hazards on both sides. That was much ignored because the Lord protected the family again and again against any hazard and raised all 6 children here. In the process of going to night school while I was teaching, both at McNeil and Clover Park, I went to the University of Puget Sound and got my master's degree in comparative literature, which helped considerably. And then in 1953, I think. After teaching Clover Park, and compiled the rest of the schools with some 54 years, I was offered a job to teach in China. Glenn Carlinzi, our neighbor, who was the CEO of Continental Grain in China, called on the telephone and said, Gaylen, I want you to come to China. And I said to him at 3 o'clock in the morning, Glenn, do you know what time it is? And he said, yes, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Beijing, China. And I said, you know what time it is here? And I said, it's midnight, and 2 and 3 o'clock. I don't know what time it is, but it's late. I said, what can I do for you? And he said, I want you to come to China. I said, why should I come to China? And he says, because you need China and China needs you. So then the next day, I asked Marion if she'd like to go to China, and she said, definitely not. I was still teaching at Clover Park after the 54th, I think it's the 54th year. I was voted by the student body to be the graduating, one of the graduating speaker. One of the graduating speakers, the adult teacher. And so in that talk, I, without telling administration or anybody, I announced in my talk that I was resigning and going to teach China next year. And so that was quite an adventure for us to go at Beijing, China. And in the process of in China, I was educated with physical therapy, massage therapy, and neuromuscular manipulation by physicians in the Beijing, China, Sino-Japanese hospital. And in that year, I would attend occasionally, one or even twice a week, the clinic. And there I learned a skill with my hands about medicine and about therapy and about healing. And the Lord opened the door for me. And while I was at the same time that I was going to school and teaching Clover Park and Tacoma Community College, it was Fort Steilacoom Community College at that time, I was also going to massage school in the evenings, and that was a gift on birthday present from our daughter Lorene and son-in-law Pat Garlock, who was working at for his physical therapy degree at University of Puget Sound. And so going to China, I did have the experience of working with Swedish massage therapy. And while I was working at that, I was involved with University Physical Therapy and Sports Medicine. And that was a clinic here in University Place by Matt Jurish and Dana Carnahan. And there was a circular that came around and said there was going to be a world conference in Beijing, China, with therapists, physical therapists, massage therapists, and people in therapy in a hospital activity. And so I took that circular to Matt and said, why don't you guys send me to Beijing, China? And I'll learn all there is to know in that seminar there. And Matt said, how much does it cost? And I said, it costs $15,000. Everything's paid. Expenses, everything is paid. And Matt said, go back to work. And that was the end of it. But the Lord had his hand in it, because I did attend that seminar in Beijing as a guest of honor, as an American who was there. And my doctor at the Sino-Japanese hospital was one of the figures that introduced me to various men in that department who were guest speakers. And the oldest chiropractor, the first chiropractor and the oldest one in China, I formally met, all because of divine intervention. I didn't have to pay this $15,000. I was given credential of being taught by great healers in China. And so I came back to Clover Park at the end of the year. Marion and I spent there, delightful time, wonderful experiences, and resigned officially from Clover Park as teacher. Well, I was happy. From then on, my son-in-law had a clinic, and I worked in his clinic. That's Pat Garlock's clinic. And 4 years later, I was invited by the church missionary department to go to Mongolia as an English teacher. The phone rang, I answered the phone, and they said, "This is the Salt Lake Mission headquarters, and we're asking you to go to Mongolia as an English teacher." And I was on the phone, Mariana was across the room, and I said, "The church is calling us to go to Mongolia on a mission. I don't want to go. I've had enough foreign countries." And Mariana said, "I'm going whether you go or not." And so the balance came back again, that she didn't want to go to China, but she wanted to go to Mongolia, and vice versa. And so we served in Mongolia a year and a half. And I didn't serve in Mexico. Marion didn't serve in Mexico, but we served the mission in Mongolia officially from the Church of Jesus Christ. So our kids, what happened to them? They survived the Sunset Beach environment, the railroad and the beach, graduated. Each one went on to college, and each survived the environment of growing up at Curtis High School, which was a marvelous experience for most of them, all of them, in fact. So that kind of brings us up to date with time I spent in college on a mission and teaching and growing and developing in the church with 6 children and trying to live the gospel, serving various callings all the time. So that's up to that point.
What got you interested in movies?
I was attending the University of Washington, and I was in a Shakespeare class. And I wrote a paper on Shakespeare, and I thought it was a pretty good paper. And in the course of that class was a very attractive blonde girl who came and sat next to me, 2 seats away. And so I moved over next to her and got acquainted with her and visited with her. And in my paper, I wrote about Shakespeare's Hamlet and why he couldn't deal with the issues with his mother and father and the king and all of the environment of that problem of growing up in royal family, which was corrupt. And I thought I wrote a good paper. And when she got her paper back, she got an A. When I got my paper back, I got a C-. And I said to her, "What did you write on anyway?" And she said, "The symbolism in Shakespeare." And I said, "What is symbolism?" And from that point on, I discovered there was a different language. In literature, there is a different language. There's a surface and there's underneath, there's a sub. And it goes into every kind of literature. It goes into film. It goes to in religion. You have a scripture that's given, and there are 2 meanings, or 3 meanings, or 4 meanings. And so I discovered in the classroom in China, we were told not to bring videos in because they don't permit videos. I put 12 videos in the bottom of my suitcase. When we went through entrance into China, we got there at 12 o'clock and everybody had gone home. And so nobody checked any luggage. We just walked right on through. And so my videos weren't bothered until I got teaching in China. And I had a graduate class, and I got permission to show films in that class. Now in China, they have no idea of imaginative interpretation. They know facts, and that's it. And so during the course of my teaching undergraduate and graduate students, I introduced them to other meanings, symbolism. And so when I taught high school in Morton, when I taught in Franklin Pierce, I began to use film. And one of the things that happened when I was going to the University of Washington, there was a film called The Red Balloon, and it won the Academy Award in that year. And I was so fascinated by it. And so it was 4 years later, when I was teaching at Clover Park, I noticed in the film catalog that The Red Balloon was there. I checked that balloon out, checked the projector out, brought it home, and watched that film 4 times one evening with all the kids. And they'll tell you about all that miserable time. And I discovered that there was a secret language to that film. And so my first irritant was that I got a C minus, and the dumb blonde, I thought, got an A. And that's the answer to your question about symbolism. Then I began to see it not only in Shakespeare, but in the written word, but I also saw it in the film. And I saw it in art. I saw it in every phase of religion or whatever. And I always walked a narrow line because it wasn't according to curriculum. They said, you don't just show it in China, and I showed them in China. I said, don't take film. I took film, and the kids loved it. And when I taught it in high school, all the time I was teaching school, I had an objection by the administration, quiet objection. They objected to the fact that I was wasting time showing film. And so what I did is on Friday, a practice that I performed in my teaching assignment, I would teach on 4 days a week. I taught from curriculum. And the 5th day, I taught my subject matter, and that was film and the literature, symbolism. That was it.
If there's something you'd want your grandkids and family to remember you by, what would it be?
My wife was first, my kids were second, and my family was third. And so I guess in the church we're taught that the most important thing is living the gospel. And if I could set an example so that the kids would follow what the church taught, that I was a good father in terms of living the gospel and trying to raise a family and love my kids and my wife. Just some insights and observations about growing up and in meeting a special person that you're going to feel strongly about in terms of courtship and marriage. I met Maureen when I was at BYU. We started going together and found it to be interesting. She being a country girl, born in Utah and lived in a ranch in Grass Valley, Utah, and I being a farm boy, born in Idaho. And so it was kind of a union of compatibility. And so we started going together, and one thing led to another, and one night we were going out, and I came to pick her up, and I was eating a Hershey bar. And she said, before we got ready to go, she said, I want to buy that. And I said, no. I said, it's mine. And we got to teasing and wrestling and fighting over that. The apartment, she lived in an apartment there were 4 girls, and there were 6 girls in that basement apartment, and it's still across the street from BYU. Oftentimes when we went back to Provo, she'd point out to the kids and tell a little story about where she lived. And so in the course of fighting over that Hershey bar, we got to wrestling and fussing, fell on the bed. I took it away from her, got it away from her, and then I kissed her when I held her on the bed, and smeared Hershey bar all over her face. And she did the same with me. And so after getting up and preparing to go out for our date, and after the roommates thought that was quite a show, we began seriously going together. And then she came to visit with my half-sister in Nampa, Idaho. Christmas vacation, we were together, and then one summer, the last summer that I was there at the Y, she came up to Seattle and spent a week with us in the family. And that's where I proposed to her, and she proposed to me, and we suggested we get married. Didn't have a dime. And so we then, in that summer, after that vacation was over, she had one more year to go, and I was going to transfer to the University of Washington. We decided then we would get married when I graduated. And when she graduated, because I had one more year at the University of Washington. And so we did get married, and in that summer I got a job in a sawmill in Seattle, and she had been teaching, and so I got drafted, and all of those pieces fit together, and so we then got married, and she taught a year while I was in the service, and then we had Guy in Fort McClellan, Alabama, our first son, redheaded, and it cost $8. So oftentimes we comment about how much he's worth. And so that's kind of a joke. We made some discoveries that if we followed the admonition of the First Presidency, you have family nights, which oftentimes was chaotic, but it helped. And along the way, we encouraged the kids to go to the university to get an education. We also encouraged them with music. Especially, I had the opportunity when I moved to Seattle to take piano lessons, and my mother said, if you take classical music, I'll pay for them, but if you don't, I'm not going to pay for them. So I was working at the Edmund Media Hotel, and in the course of once a month, the Rotary Club had a big party there, not a party, a dinner, and in the course of hearing a piano player play during that dinner they were having, I took lessons and started my career with playing the piano. And then we encouraged the kids to play the piano. And each one of them had an opportunity to take music lessons. And that developed character. And in the course also, when I was in high school, I started playing the guitar. And I liked the guitar and didn't care much for Western, but I liked the rock and roll and kind of music, that beat. And so through the years, I've continued to enjoy sharing in the classroom, in Mongolia, in China, the guitar. I'd get a guitar and we'd learn folk musics, and I was teach English through the guitar. And also, I always had a love for, the ukulele. And when I was going to Y, there was a kid came up from California who played the ukulele and stayed at the house that I was living in with the organ. It was called the Organ House, and there were 10 organ kids there, and I was the only Washington kid. And this kid came and he played the ukulele. So I went down to the Hawk Shop and bought a ukulele for $3.50. Now that was a very interesting ukulele because we would play it. I turned out for the wrestling team, and the coach would have a tenor voice, beautiful tenor voice. And one day we were going to have a meet with the University of Utah, and he said, now before we go, the team comes in and you go in, he says, I want you guys to relax. And so I brought the ukulele, and I played the ukulele, and the kids sang songs in the locker room, and he came in and said, what's going on? And So we said, you told us to relax. And from that point on, I was privileged to ride in the coach's car, because we drove cars when we went to the University of Utah, Utah State, went to different in our league. And I had music and I had the ukulele and I sang with a beautiful tenor singer, the coach. And that's one of the reasons that I was, I think, on the wrestling team. Music helped. Whether it was in Mongolia or BYU, wherever it was, music played a role in our lives. And we encouraged that for kids. And one of my favorite groups was the Beatles. And I introduced the kids when that came out, first off into the classroom at Hutloff Junior High, in which I got administration wondering why I was wasting time, and parents said, that's not the way you teach English. But the Beatles, I thought, was, and still do, have a fondness for the Beatles. So music is part of our lives, and Christmas time when we come together, it's a pleasure to watch and see our children and grandchildren play music. Our anthem at Christmas time is "Be a Friend." And on Mary's tombstone, if you've read it, it's called "Be a Friend."
What will be on your tombstone?
Well, I beg your pardon. Hers is, I think it's wonderful. And mine's to be a friend. I think that's what it is.
That's what it'll be.
Yeah, it's already on there. Be a friend. The essence of this is, how do you feel about music? Not that you can play music. And so if I were a concert pianist, I'd say, give me an hour of time and I'll show you.
Yeah.
One thing that Marion and I insisted upon is, as my mother did, is you get a college education. Education is the means of becoming free of not only ignorance. My mother said, I want your college education. My dad said, I want you to have a testimony of the gospel. And he did. He had a very strong testimony. He said, as long as you'll stay close to the Lord, He'll help you. And I testify that that has been the underlying feature in my development, is that that's called again serendipity. The Lord has things in store for you that might not be on your agenda, but that's called divine intervention. And so I think that I was able to serve a mission, and both Marion and I taught English in China, and we were counseled when we were leaving to teach. We were at the Y teaching, and we had 3 weeks orientation before we left, and had to go to the Y at the Kennedy Center. And we were told by one of the general authorities that you're going to China to open the door for eventually the missionary program. And so we kind of considered that as a mission. And also we knew that Mongolia was a formal mission, and in both those places I used music to open the door to the English language, to foreigners. And so music and education and the gospel has been the foundation for, I think, a happy family.